Every other weekend. A short horror story. HAB call all. The Subaru's engine shut down smooth with no post-idle rattle. Caitlin stayed behind the wheel, breathing through her mouth, wishing she could twist another key and do the same to her nerves. In front of her, the client's house was a hulking, shadowed mass. Caitlin already knew one thing about the place: the evil that haunted its walls didn't give a damn that she was outside. The frenzied quiver in her chest told her so. 30 years ago, when she'd just started out, she dismissed the frenetic, internal gloom as nervousness. Then, upon entering that night's home, she'd found herself face to face with a demonic entity. It had stood right next to the young couple who'd called for help, a look of rage smoldering on its crimson face. That old codger had torn the cupboard doors off their hinges before heading home, a dangerous being indeed. Since then she'd felt the quiver dozens of times. It had never signaled anything good. Tonight's apprehension felt different somehow. Tonight felt worse. A professional carried on, she told herself, and exited her car. The wet chill immediately battered her, making her cinch her overcoat. Her bones hated the cold more and more each year. A short distance ahead, the porch light was a dull yellow sphere in the murk. Curls of fog looped around it, meandering like well-fed garden snakes. Suddenly, the sound of dry branches rustling together startled her. Instinctively, she turned to the noise and saw a cat leap out of the bushes. The tawny-colored animal slunk across her path, head angled low to the ground, and fierce eyes fixed on her. Its ears were exaggeratedly tall and pointed, two cone-shaped birthday hats perched on its head. For a breathless second, Caitlin was certain that it was sneering at her. Then it was gone, swallowed by the churning fog. "Glad you made it." She hadn't heard the front door open. The man in the doorway sounded like the client she'd talked to on the phone earlier. Yet his face looked 2 decades older than he'd claimed. "Some fog, isn't it, Mr. Tremaine?" Caitlin asked. Yes, he said, gesturing for her to enter with one hand. A long tendril of fog whipped past Tremaine and wove into the living room, evaporating in the air behind him. A second trail wound past his left hip, a ghostly eel exploring the room. It, too, dissipated. Goose flesh prickled in the small of Caitlin's back and she hurried the rest of the way. Tremaine shut the door behind her, sealing them in a cavernous living room. "Want a cup?" He wagged one hand at a coffee table, cluttered by a French press, mugs and dinner plates. The dish on the left held a hot dog and potato chips, obviously untouched. "Looks like one of you wasn't very hungry tonight." She spoke gently, trying to put the man at ease even though her own sixth sense was sputtering into overdrive. "No coffee for me, thank you." Tremaine filled one of the mugs. His hands shook and brown drops splattered the tabletop. He kept his jaw clenched and seemed to be breathing in shallow, rapid breaths. Judging from the bags under his eyes, the last thing he needed was more caffeine. She was used to finding her clients in such a state. Being haunted can do that to a person. "You said the issue was with your little boy, correct?" It was always best to get started quickly. One never knew how long it would take. Besides, sometimes the spirits hid in clever places: a spider's web, the folds of a curtain, the square of shadow behind a hanging picture. The small talk gave her time to seek them out. Yes, my little boy, you got that right. How old is he?" She took a few steps, smiling, casting her eyes over the paneled walls and furniture. 9, almost 10. Boys are wonderful at that age. At the entryway, a child's colorful overnight bag leaned against the wall next to a pair of small, glossy dress shoes. "How long has he been experiencing the haunting?" No, you misunderstood. He's not the one being haunted." It wasn't like her to miss the details, much less the main factors. Immediately, she reviewed her mental notes. The call had come in around 4:30, a hurried conversation, all pleading tones and worry. William Tremaine, 34 years old, divorced, father of one, a boy. She could have sworn he'd said it was his son dealing with the haunting. I'm the one it's here to torture. Clients had described it in varying ways, everything from sensing a presence to actually seeing one. Sometimes, when the spirit was physically aggressive or non-human, they used the words harassed or stalked. Tortured was a first. I see, she said, taking a closer look at him. His skin had slackened around his jaw, giving him the jowls of a tired old man. The aged face was out of sync with the youthful, camping coat he wore zipped to his neck. It fully dawned on her then, staring at that blue, woolen coat, how chilly the room was. Mr. Tremaine, I don't mean to be rude, but are you having trouble with the heat? It's damn cold in this house, he said, nodding. And your son is here, isn't he? Don't worry. The cold won't bother him a bit. Take a seat, please. Let's get down to business. We'll see if you can solve my problem. She sunk into the couch and adjusted her coat to hold in some body heat. Can you tell me a little about what you've been experiencing? You'll experience it, too, he said, swishing one jittering finger in the air above his head. It's the backstory that you need to know. Will you be taking notes? Do you want a pen and some paper? That won't be necessary. He sat down in the chair closest to her and crossed his legs. With one hand, he drummed on his knee for a bit. After that he simply sat with his head cocked to one side. A long minute passed. Mr. Tremaine? You were saying? We were happy once, he blurted, truly, very happy. It's important that you know that. I'm talking about me and my ex-wife. Let me ask you something, the coat you're wearing, is it a man's coat? It is, she said. He uncrossed his legs and sat up. It's a very old coat. He leaned forward. He's been around a long time. Am I right? Personal questions were delicate. Some clients were haunted only by the mental illness that galloped through their brains. They needed a different sort of professional to find their peace. It was best to keep those callers at a cautious distance. She gave him a polite, quick nod. He loves you enough to let you wear his coat, Tremaine said. Keep your eyes on him. Love falls apart when you're not looking at it. If I've learned anything, that's it. Oh yes, yes. I take it that the happiness didn't last. You got that right. Audrey, my ex, stopped supporting my success. She believed that we'd won our share and should step aside to let somebody else win theirs. What she never understood, what I could never get across to her, was that I needed the game more than the winnings. The divorce was for everyone's benefit, especially the kids. You understand, don't you? Her heart continued to pound in her chest as if trying to shake off the pulsing shiver that surrounded it. Regardless, she kept her tone soft and reassuring. Of course. Everything was easy at first. Audrey was content to walk away with the kid. I motivated that decision, of course, with a generous settlement. That's a fact. It was a small price to pay to end the misery and I was happy to hand it over. Her mother ruined all of that. That crazy old hag never liked me in the first place. She was the one that made Audrey believe it wasn't enough. An amicable split was impossible after that. The glint in his eyes was as cold as the air in the room. It was possible, she thought, that Tremaine was one of the crazy ones. Her Google search on him had found that he was a serial entrepreneur, software and startups his double specialty. People respected and feared him. None of his millions mattered now. An ugly divorce, the trauma stirred into such an event, could derail anyone. That didn't explain the quiver, however. I retaliated. I can be one vindictive son of a bitch when I want to. I admit it, you see? That should count for something. Oh yes, yes, that should mean a lot. I can see that you're under a lot of duress. Yes, yes, he cut her off. Very good word for it, duress, a notion of the stuff. Would you like to tell me how the haunting began? I am, he said, the bitterness clear in his voice. I'm telling you all the terrible details. The truth of this situation. I admit, For instance, that I was not an attentive father. It's important that you know that, too. I'm sure you did your best." Caitlin caught a flicker of motion on the floor and leaned slightly to look. A fat, beige-colored insect scurried across the living room and under the couch. Cockroach. Then she thought better. Roaches were black or a lustrous brown. This was some sort of fast-moving beetle. Audrey's divorce attorney came at me hard. Tremaine's eyes darkened further. "I told my lawyers, you'd do the same. My exact words were make her pay in tears. It's the way of this world, isn't it? When love is dead, we kill the lover. That's their punishment for caring about us in the first place." Caitlin bit on her lower lip and waited for him to continue, her calm expression in place despite her pounding heartbeat. "We went at her from all directions, accused her of infidelity, drug use, alcoholism, inappropriate behavior in front of the kid, you name it. None of it was true. Perhaps that's why I didn't win. That and the fact that I'd given Audrey plenty of ammunition to lob at me. I got a good butt kicking in that courtroom along with this ridiculous stammer. I didn't always say yes or no like some kind of babbling idiot. I thought nothing of it," she said. "Divorce can take a toll on anyone. Losing is what takes the toll," he said. "The judge was kind enough to grant me every other weekend with the kid, and I wanted my time. Oh, yes, I demanded it. Enforced that court order. Insisted that she have him packed and ready for pickup or, if she was busy, bring him to me not 1 second late. I'd never spent so much time with him. You must understand it wasn't about the child. He was a weapon," Caitlin said. Yes, exactly. Our son was the axe. I swung him to maim her soul. You've heard the saying that the heart wants what it wants? My heart craved vengeance. They were bringing him to me the night of the accident. My ex-wife and her mother, the meddler. You might have noticed the road has some sharp turns. Remember, I told you to drive carefully. I did, she said. My tires still hit the gravel a time or two. The fog made it hard to see the road. It's not a dangerous drive on a clear day. But in a downpour? At dusk? That's another story. They missed a turn. Simple as that. The injuries they sustained, well, they were fatal. I'm very sorry. He wasn't mad. Grief-stricken, no doubt, and racked with guilt, but not crazy. At least his little boy had survived. The haunting began after the funerals. If I understand you correctly, you believe your ex-wife or ex-mother-in-law is doing the haunting. Or is it both of them? The lights flickered. Darkness filled the room for a beat. Caitlin blinked when the overheads came back on, and, when her eyes adjusted, she saw Tremaine smiling. She could tell it had once been a boyish, cocky smile. Now it resembled a skull's toothy grin. My boy's awake now. He stood and strode across the floor. At the foot of the steps, he waited for her, one hand stretched out and shaking. Come upstairs with me. Caitlin stayed on the couch, thinking about the beetle and the oppressive cold in the house and the dreadful fog outside and the cat that had disappeared in its churn. She continued breathing from her stomach, holding her instinct to hair away from panic. Then the television set popped on and a sports announcer shouted with maniacal glee. Caitlin held back a surprised shout. The channel changed on its own. Animated characters filled the screen. Please, Tremaine repeated. Come upstairs. Carry on, she reminded herself. Caitlin crossed the living room floor and followed him to the upper level. He turned on a light and led her down a hallway. Then he opened a door. My son, he said. The boy sat at the foot of the bed, wearing only pajama bottoms. He'd undergone a major operation, evident by the wishbone-shaped incisions on his chest and middle. It had been a hurried procedure, and recent. Caitlin felt her knees wobble. Her heart accelerated into a dangerous rhythm. The boy's chest had been sutured closed with coarse, black thread. No healing had taken place. His scars were not from surgery, but from his autopsy. The fog came first, Tremaine said. Then he rang the doorbell. A light odor of funeral incense hung in the air and, underneath that, something bitter and chemical. Embalming fluid, she guessed. The boy's head swiveled, looking from the floor to the two of them. Caitlin heard a distinct grinding sound, boots stepping on sand, until the boy's head stopped. He looked right at her, eyes crusted with a white film, like frozen pus. "He'll stay until Monday," Tremaine said. "Then he'll hug me. Tell me, 'I love you, Daddy.' After that, he'll open the door and step outside. The weather will clear. I'll stay here, half mad from him, which is exactly what they want. Yes, yes. Audrey and her mother, they will bring me to my knees." The boy's raspy giggle sent a shudder down Caitlin's back. Part of her wanted to flee to the Subaru where she could shriek by herself. The rest of her, the professional, silently screamed in disgust and gawked at the boy. He rose from the bed, each movement as stiff as his dress shoes downstairs, and began moving. He stepped toward the bookshelf on the opposite wall, a mannequin learning to walk. When he was a toddler, he hated bedtime stories, Tremaine said. They always meant that night was right around the corner. Now he loves to sit on my lap and be read to. He's so dug heavy. The muscles on Tremaine's neck stood out as he leaned down to the boy. "Jeremy, you like stories, don't you?" "Yes, Daddy." His voice was a hoarse gurgle. He didn't sound like that before the accident. I assume his larynx was damaged. "Do you want to feel his breath?" Caitlin felt her head sway left and right. All of her, it seemed, had gone numb. The light appeared to be dimming and, in spite of the cold radiating from the dead boy, she felt exceptionally warm now. She covered her mouth with one hand, aware that at any second she'd lose consciousness. "Can you help me?" Caitlin dropped to the floor. She fought the dizziness, professionals didn't faint, and managed to catch herself with one arm. The last thing she saw before the darkness overtook her was the boy's bone-white feet stepping toward her. Or was the boy's bone-white feet stepping toward her? Or was the boy's bone-white feet